When the Constitution was drawn up in 1787, the theory of the Constitution is very simple. It is that you can't trust anybody. You can't trust good people to be running the country. So the theory of the Constitution was to check vice with vice, to make the various parts of the government, all of which the Founding Fathers assumed would be under control of greedy, avaricious, and self-serving people, to make them check each other to keep any one of them, any one part of the government, from creating a tyranny over the people. And that's why Hamilton thought that it was not necessary to have a Bill of Rights, because the Constitution was so carefully drawn that it would be impossible for any part of the government to impose a tyranny over the people. But in order to get the Constitution ratified, the states demanded an additional guarantee of individual rights. And that's where we got the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights, which were submitted to the states and ratified in 1791, which was 4 years after the Constitution itself was ratified. In order to get the Constitution ratified, the fathers, particularly Hamilton and James Madison, engaged in some very heavy letter writing and pamphleteering. And they published a series of articles in the New York newspapers called the Federalist Papers in favor of the federal government. New York was a key state. New York was not by any means sure to ratify the Constitution. And in order to get it ratified by New York, which after all was the most important commercial state in the North, the Federalist Papers were printed trying to convince popular opinion in New York to ratify the Constitution, and eventually they did. But notice that James Madison takes a position in favor of a strong central government at this time. And after all, Madison was one of the leading people at the convention. His notes are our best record of what happened at the Constitutional Convention. Thomas Jefferson, who was Madison's political mentor, was not there. He was in France as ambassador to France at the time of the Constitutional Convention. So Madison was pretty much on his own. Later on, Jefferson returned from France and began to wonder about how he could possibly become president. George Washington, of course, was the first president, was elected twice with no dissent. But after Washington, John Adams, the Massachusetts Federalist, became president. And Jefferson began to wonder, how could he ever become president? Jefferson and Madison then invented something that the Founding Fathers had not thought of: political parties. The original assumption of the Constitution was that there were never going to be national political organizations. The states were too widely separated, too independent in thought, and they never anticipated there would be national political organizations. They thought that every state would elect its own candidate as president, and that consequently every election, every presidential election, would probably be decided in the House of Representatives, because the provisions of the Constitution are that if no one gets a majority in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives decides the president. The idea of the House of Representatives deciding the president was also favorable to the southern states, because you recall, the southern states, with the advantage of the 3/5 rule and the fact that Virginia was the biggest state in the first place, anticipated control of the House of Representatives, which meant that they would not only control the House, but they would also determine the election of the president in the House. Well, Jefferson and Madison came along with the idea of a national political organization. They had really no basis to put it on, but what they did was to oppose anything that John Adams stood for. And that included opposing a strong interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson evolved the idea that the Constitution was intended to be a loose compact between the states which maintained, quote, states' rights, unquote. He called it strict construction of the Constitution. That is to say, nothing that was specifically not said in the Constitution could be done by the federal government. This was the theory on which Jefferson and his sidekick Madison developed a political organization to oppose John Adams and the Federalists and Hamilton. And in 1800, indeed, Jefferson won the presidency in an election which was decided in New York by Alexander Hamilton. It's a great story. The two leading candidates were Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Neither one of them had a majority in the Electoral College. They deadlocked with the exact same number of electoral votes. And then each state delegation had to decide who they were going to vote for in the House. The New York delegation was headed by Alexander Hamilton, Jefferson's bitter rival, but Jefferson not only was Hamilton's rival, so was Burr. Burr was in New York politics also, and Jefferson and Burr were closer philosophically than Jefferson and Hamilton, or Hamilton and Burr. And moreover, Hamilton considered Burr a scoundrel. And indeed, nobody knows exactly what kind of a scoundrel Aaron Burr may have been. But in the final balloting, as the deadline grew closer and closer to inauguration day with no president, Hamilton convinced the New York delegation, which was controlled by the Federalists, that between the two evils, Jefferson and Burr, both of whom were their opponents, that Jefferson was the better of two evils. And so Hamilton swung the New York delegation to support Jefferson, and Jefferson was elected president. Burr was so angry that he never got over it, and in fact, 4 years later, shot Hamilton to death in a duel. The most famous duel in American history, Weehawken, New Jersey. Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton, his political rival. But in the meantime, Hamilton had ensured the election of Jefferson as president of the United States. And then came one of the great ironies in American history. Remember Jefferson's theory of strict construction of the Constitution. But in 1803, Napoleon, who at this time was faced with the dissolution of part of his empire, decided that he couldn't wait, needed cash quickly, and couldn't wait for his empire in North America to develop, and he offered for sale the entire Louisiana territory claimed by France. Now, Jefferson originally set out with the idea of just buying New Orleans, because that was the mouth of the Mississippi River, and of course very important to the western farmers who wanted to send goods down the Mississippi. But Napoleon countered with an offer of all of the Louisiana territory, so much territory that nobody knew exactly how much there really was out there, the whole watershed of the Missouri River. Jefferson's own theory of the Constitution would forbid him from making that purchase, because nowhere in the Constitution does it say anything about the president's power to buy territory from a foreign power. And yet Jefferson proved that he was indeed a great man as well as a politician, because he ignored his own constitutional scruples, realizing that they didn't have time to get a constitutional amendment passed before Napoleon would withdraw the offer, and he agreed to make the deal with Napoleon for $15 million, even though it violated his own theory of the Constitution. This was probably one of the great accomplishments that Thomas Jefferson ever did. The deal turned out to be the best real estate deal in the history of the world. $15 million for a territory that doubled the size of North America of the United States, literally doubled the size, and made it a continental power. In order to explore exactly what they had bought, Jefferson sent his secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and another Virginia military man, William Clark, on an expedition up the Missouri River to find out what they had purchased. Lewis and Clark took, I think it was 29 or 30 men, something like that, set out from St. Louis in a flatboat in 1804, and explored the Missouri River, crossed the Rocky Mountains, came down the Columbia, reached the Pacific coast in the state of Washington, and journeyed back. It took them 2.5 or 3 years, and on the way they saw animal life that had never been seen by Europeans. They saw Indians, met Indians, dealt with the tribes, never had trouble with the Indians, returned without losing a single man except for one man who died of appendicitis. And it was one of the great adventures in all of American history, Lewis and Clark expedition, which was sent to map, and indeed did map, a whole vast territory of the North American continent, never previously seen by Europeans. Meanwhile, in Jefferson's administration, another event occurred that was to have epic repercussions. Robert Fulton, who was a boy from Lancashire, Pennsylvania, who was always interested in mechanics, developed, although he didn't invent, but developed a practical steamboat. And in 1807, his boat, called the Claremont, which was actually built on behalf of Robert Livingston of New York, sailed up the Hudson River from New York to Albany against the current, 150 miles in 32 hours. And it proved that the steam engine could conquer adverse currents, and that the steamboat could practically handle large quantities of goods. This had tremendous implications for the western rivers. The rivers just bought, the Missouri and the Mississippi, and of course previously the Ohio. And immediately after the end of the War of 1812, steamboats began to work upriver, up the Mississippi from New Orleans north, as well as down. River commerce before then had been on flatboats and what they called keelboats. The flatboats were simply huge rafts, basically, with goods carried on them. When they got to New Orleans, they broke them up and used the wood for houses in New Orleans. Keelboats were actually worked up the river by hand. They'd come down the river with a load of goods, and then pole them back up the river laboriously all the way up back north again. Mike Fink, the legendary keelboat man, is the hero of keelboatmen. And if you go to Disneyland, you'll see models of Mike Fink's keelboats. But when the steam engines came out on the western rivers, steamboats came out on the western rivers, it meant that commerce could go both ways. Not only could goods be brought, agricultural products be brought down the river, but goods could be brought up the river. And New Orleans immediately became a leading port, one of the most important ports in North America, and it still is to this day. The natural flow of commerce then was down from the western cities of Cincinnati and Louisville and St. Louis, St. Paul, down the river to New Orleans, and finished goods came up the river from New Orleans to those western outposts. This meant that the Northwest and the Southwest, Louisiana and Iowa and all the, were closer to each other in natural terms and in geographical, in transportation terms, than either of them were to the East Coast. And so if in 1815 you had said there's going to be a civil war in the United States, you would have immediately jumped to the conclusion that the Civil War would be between the West, the Trans-Appalachian West, and the East Coast. And indeed, that was the natural order of the continent, the national division of the continent. However, a further application of steam power was to change all that in the next 35 years. Between 1815 and 1860, when the American Civil War began, there are four dominant themes. The first is a spectacular growth in the population of the United States, almost unbelievable growth. For example, in 1790, New York City had 49,000 people. By 1850, it had 700,000. The whole United States country had 4 million people at the turn of the century and 31 million by 1860. In other words, the population increased 700% in only 50 years or so. Part of this population increase was because people had huge families. It was not unusual to have 14 children, 16 children, 18 children. And secondly, immigration. The early immigration to the United States had always come basically from England and Scotland and Wales, and continued to do so until around 1840. But then something else happened. The American experience was heard in Europe, the opportunities for land, the opportunities for higher wages, for freedom, new life, and people began to come from other parts of Europe to America, most notably from two countries which had revolutions in 1848 which were suppressed, Germany and Ireland. And indeed, in Ireland, there was not only a revolution, there was also the potato famine. The potato famine in Ireland was so bad that literally a third of the population of Ireland either died or emigrated in the period between 1840 and 1900. One third of the people in Ireland either died or left the country, and most of those who left the country came to North America, particularly to Boston and New York City. Then in Germany, the Revolution of 1848 was put down, and many Germans left their country at that point, went into exile, and many of them came to America. There had always been a German community in America because as far back as 1690, William Penn made a deal with a German pastor named Daniel Francis Pastorius to bring Germans to Pennsylvania to help settle his land there. And, of course, the land was worth nothing without settlers. The Germans turned out to be very hardworking, efficient, sober farmers and very good settlers. And Penn was perfectly happy to have them in Pennsylvania. They were called the Pennsylvania Dutch. Of course, there wasn't anything Dutch at all about them, but you can imagine what must have happened when the nearest English-speaking farmer came up to his new neighbor and said, "Hi there, I'm Smith, who are you?" And the new man would say, "Ich verstehe, ich bin Deutsch." "Oh, you're Dutch, are you? Okay." And that's how Deutsch, German for German, became Pennsylvania Dutch. If you looked at the United States in this period of this tremendous growth of population, you would find something else happening. Cities were growing very, very much more important. In the colonial period, there were indeed 3 or 4 key cities. All of them were ports: Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, New York, Boston. But most of the population, a vast majority of the population, lived in rural areas. However, remember our old story about how the seacoasts and the mountains are close together in the Northeast, and that the mountains get further away from the seacoast as they go further south? Well, mountains also mean waterfalls. They mean that rivers are not navigable beyond the waterfalls. And so if you look in the north, you will find the head of navigation on the Hudson is at Albany, which is 150 miles from New York. The head of navigation on the rivers from Massachusetts is even closer to the seacoast. They don't go very far inland, and that's also true in Rhode Island, for example. And so consequently, you couldn't ship goods from Europe into the interior without taking them off the ocean-going ship, which couldn't get past the fall line, and transporting them by horseback or canal boat or whatever. Consequently, cities grew up around those fall lines because there were natural transshipment points for goods coming from the east, from Europe. In the south, however, where the mountains are further from the seacoast, ocean-going ships could sail right up to the plantation dock. And so cities didn't grow up in the South. With the exception of Charleston, South Carolina, the South and New Orleans, the South had virtually no big cities. All the cities were in the North. And when the immigrants began coming, where did they come? Well, they didn't go to the South, even though the Southerners had originally felt that nobody would ever go north because it was too cold there. They didn't go south because they didn't want to compete with slave labor and because there were no opportunities in cities for them to make money. Instead, they settled in the northern cities, where there were opportunities and where they did not compete with slave labor. And so consequently, look what happened to the growth of northern cities. Baltimore, 13,000 people in 1790, 169,000 in 1850. Boston went from 18,000 to 136,000. Philadelphia from 28,000 to 121,000. Louisville had 200 people at the Falls of the Ohio in 1790. It had 45,000 60 years later. Providence went from 6,000 people to 40,000. Albany from 3,000 to 50,000. All these northern cities grew rapidly in this period between the end of the War of 1812 and 1860. And when the impact of steam power was felt on the rivers, it was also felt in the cities. Originally, the falls of these fall lines, these cities, became sources of water power. And particularly in New England, textile mills were operated by water power. The first one was built in England by Richard Arkwright. And the British realized that the value of the textile mills was so enormous that they forbid anyone from taking patents or drawings or parts of mills out of England. But a man named Samuel Slater, who was a mechanical genius, memorized the makings of a textile mill and came to Rhode Island and built a mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, Slater's Mill, the first factory building in America. And he used water power, the rivers in Rhode Island, to power his mill at Pawtucket. The textile industry began in New England, and it was the beginning of the factory system in America. Previously, work was done, textile work particularly, sewing, was done by hand at home. Now, machinery was installed in a central location powered by water, and the people came to work in the factory. An enormous change in the way of life. You're drawing people out of their homes, away from the land, into an urban environment where they work for a living, for wages, in a factory instead of working at home. The next step was the application of steam power to the factories, because you could only build a factory where there was a waterfall before steam power. However, there aren't enough waterfalls to go around. But since the development of the steam engine in Britain in the 1750s, 1760, the practical steam engine became usable for factory power. And so it was no longer necessary to have a waterfall to power your factory. You could power it with a steam engine. And so the big cities, which had started with the water power, began to grow much bigger with the expansion of the factory system powered by steam. Steam power is the crucial motivating force of the 19th century, with all it entails. Steam engines demand iron. You can't make a steam engine out of wood. Secondly, they demand coal. Originally, wood was used for fuel, and England was deforested so quickly that soon they had to find an alternative. And the alternative turned out to be coal, which was much more efficient, burned better, produced more steam per the square inch, and cost less. But that meant enormous searches for coal, and since coal weighs a good deal, ways of transporting coal were needed. The first thing they did was to build roads and pull coal by horsepower on the roads. Then came canals. Canals were expensive to build, and they had the disadvantage of freezing over in the winter, but they could handle a great deal of goods, and they could handle it very cheaply. And there was a burst of canal building in the United States in the early part of the 19th century, the most famous and most important being the Erie Canal, which was built to connect Albany, the head of navigation on the Hudson, with Buffalo at Lake Erie. It had to cross 300 miles of New York State to do it. And it cost $7 million, which was an enormous sum at that time. It was promoted by the governor of New York, DeWitt Clinton, and it was called Clinton's Ditch, or Clinton's Folly. But no sooner was it completed in 1825 than huge amounts of western grain, coal, and other commodities began going across the state of New York by canal boat down the Hudson River to New York City, where they were transshipped for Europe. And with this stimulus of the Erie Canal, New York began to bound ahead of all the other American cities. The Erie Canal was the stimulus that made New York the great city of the United States. After all, it's a great port, but so are some other cities great ports. But New York, with the Erie Canal, had access to greater interior and could attract more flow of goods from elsewhere in the interior of the country. Hand in hand with this, with the improved transportation, came the ability to settle new lands in the West and make a profit at what you were doing. And after the Indian barrier was broken in the War of 1812 with the defeat of the Indians, settlers poured into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan in the north, into Tennessee, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas in the south. New lands were opened up. For the Southerners, there was particularly a reason for having to go to new land because tobacco and cotton, the two principal crops in the South, are very hard on the soil. And Virginia's soil was becoming worn out by the early part of the 19th century, having been exploited for 200 years without rest. And so the new soil in the West was very attractive to Southern planters who were dependent on commercial crops. And so they pushed west and found virgin soil for their big cotton crops, while the North was growing grain, wheat, and corn. And settlers flocked to those areas, largely coming from Europe and the old part of the United States, the Northeast. Together with these changes, with the factory system, the exploitation of new lands, and new transportation, rapid social change produced rapid social reform. Every kind of institution was called into question at this period, from approximately 1820 on. There was a questioning of the idea of marriage. Was marriage worthwhile? And communities were started in which marriage was not practiced. The Shakers were celibates, for example. Others shared the women in common. But in all kinds of experiments were tried with new styles of life. There was dress reform. Amelia Bloomer made bloomers famous for women. There was temperance reform. Americans had always been a very hard-drinking people. Now in the 19th century, in this early part of the 19th century, there came thinking that liquor was the devil's own tool, and that all the ills of society, or many of the ills of society, could be cured if people would only stop drinking. The temperance reform movement of the 19th century actually culminated 100 years later with Prohibition, and it worked about as well as you'd expect. But the temperance reform movement was part of this great growth of reform fervor that followed the rapid, enormous social change and social growth of this early period of the 20th century, 19th century rather. A third thing was food reform. Go to the store today and buy a box of graham crackers. Chances are you don't realize that they were invented by a Dr. Sylvester Graham as the perfect health food that would solve all your diet problems. And it would make you a nice person, too, because Dr. Graham believed that you were what you eat, and if you ate animals, then you would become bestial, and so if you ate sugared or powdered groceries, you become effete and effeminate, and so he developed the graham cracker as the perfect food. And the graham cracker dates from this period of reform. There was women's rights reform. 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention met at Seneca Falls, New York. And by the way, the fact that it met at Seneca Falls is itself very interesting because Seneca Falls was a classic case of one of those mill towns that developed with steam power. And the reason the Women's Rights Convention met there is because Elizabeth Cady Stanton happened to be living in a house there, which was owned by her husband's father as part of the development of this Western territory. But Seneca Falls, the Women's Rights Convention of 1848, there were also perfectionist communities. Communities that experimented with the public ownership or communal ownership of property. Some of them were religiously based, like New Harmony, Indiana, which was founded by a German society from Pennsylvania, or Oneida, New York. Some of them were theoretical communism, where they shared everything in common. But above all the other drives, above all the other reform movements, anti-slavery reform became the most important and the most powerful. Anti-slavery reform began in the North, where, of course, there was no slavery because it was uneconomic. But actually, the early anti-slavery movement that was really important was in the South. And in 1830, Virginia very nearly emancipated its slaves. The only reason that Virginia did not go through with emancipation in 1830 was because the state legislature simply didn't have the money to pay off the slave owners for the contracts of their slaves. And then in 1831, something happened that changed the mind of the South on its move towards anti-slavery. In Southampton County, Virginia, a house slave named Nat Turner, who was a very religious man, a very mild-mannered man who had the best of everything, was as best as slavery could be. He was illiterate. He could read and write, which was not true of many slaves. In fact, it was forbidden to teach slaves to read and write, but Nat Turner had been taught. He wasn't a field hand. He wasn't overworked. He wasn't sold away from his family or anything. He was almost a member of the family. But Nat Turner was also one of those people who gets religious visions. And he got one that told him to murder all the whites and set up a black slave independence. And he and his associates murdered 50 people in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831, and it drove the South absolutely wild. Because slavery was not only a labor system, it was also a system of racial relations, one in which the white man controlled the black man. But with the Nat Turner Rebellion, fear of a slave insurrection became a dominant factor in the South, even though the South didn't like to admit it. Southerners always like to say, well, our slaves are happy with what they are. In fact, we're good to them, and it's the best situation for them. One Southern writer named George Fitzhugh actually encouraged the North to institute slavery for its factory hands because he said it's more humane than letting them go home and starve if they can't get a job. And after all, slavery provided a cradle-to-grave Social Security system. And when you were too old to work as a slave, you still stayed in the slave quarters in the plantation and dug your own little garden and helped raise the children. And it wasn't cradle-to-grave security. Of course, it was not security with any kind of liberty. But the slave system then became a matter of fear of a slave revolt such as the Southampton County Revolt. And if it could happen with Nat Turner, it could happen with anybody. Because Nat Turner was, of all the slaves, the least likely to have a slave insurrection, to lead a slave insurrection. And Southerners were terribly, terribly afraid. And from 1831 on, Northern anti-slavery, which was never much of a movement in terms of numbers, but was very strident, very vocal, became a threat, seen as a threat from the outside to the South. About 1824, there was a political change in the country as well. Following Jefferson and Madison, the next president was James Monroe, who came to office in 1816 and spent 8 years as president. It's known as the era of good feeling in American politics because there was virtually no opposition, no organized opposition to Monroe, who followed in the footsteps of Jefferson and Madison as what they called a democratic, almost a nationwide party, which adopted Jefferson's principles of strict construction of the Constitution, even if Jefferson himself didn't go along with them. But when Monroe left office in 1824, there was a wild scramble for the presidency. There were 4 candidates. Only three of them, by the Constitution, could be considered by the House of Representatives. The 4 candidates were John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, the colonial leader, John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, Henry Clay of Kentucky, William Harris Crawford of Georgia, and Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. Andrew Jackson became famous in the first place by his astounding victory over the British in the War of 1812 at New Orleans. The American Agincourt, the losses were so heavily one-sided, the British lost 1,500 men and Jackson hardly lost 50. And it made Jackson a legend, military legend. He was also famous as an Indian fighter, and he hanged a couple of British citizens in Florida as spies, which endeared him to the frontier. Andrew Jackson was the macho man of the western frontier. And he was the popular hero, the man on the white horse, so to speak. But in that election of 1824, Jackson got the most electoral votes, but he didn't get a majority. Clay got the least number of electoral votes and was dropped from consideration because the Constitution provides that the House of Representatives may vote only on the top 3 when there is no majority in the Electoral College. The other 2 candidates were John Quincy Adams and William Harris Crawford. But Crawford suffered a stroke between the election and the time of the Electoral College met, and consequently, he was not seriously considered either, which left it between Jackson and John Quincy Adams. Clay swung his support to Adams, and in turn was named Secretary of State in the new Adams administration. Adams was elected by the throwing of Clay's support. The Jackson people howled to high heaven about this corrupt bargain, because up until then, the traditional position before becoming president had been Secretary of State. Monroe had been Madison's Secretary of State. Madison had been Jefferson's Secretary of State. And so the Jacksonians interpreted this as a deal between Adams and Clay, where Adams became president this time, and then the Adams people would support Clay the next time, and their man, Jackson, would be shut out of the presidency. And in 1828, Jackson Jackson ran against Adams in one of the most vicious elections in all of American history. You think we have vicious elections today? Nothing like the name-calling that went on in the 19th century. The things the Jackson people called Adams, they called him a monarchist. They claimed that he was trying to become king of the United States. Well, of course, all this was nonsense. The Adams people added their guns, they turned their heavy guns on Jackson, too. Jackson had married a divorced woman whose name was Rachel Robards, and he loved her very much, was very protective of her in the old style of the frontier. But it turned out that there had been some technical irregularity in Rachel Robards' divorce, and she hadn't legally been divorced at the time she married Jackson, although she thought she was. Well, this, of course, caused great fuel for the Adams guns. They called Rachel a bigamist, and Jackson took it personally, and he was absolutely furious and just absolutely went frantic over these attacks on his wife. Jackson, with the popular support of the West, won the election of 1824, swept into the White House as a nationalist president, but a nationalist president whose principles were very much against strong national government. One of the things Andrew Jackson did was to refuse to charter the Bank of the United States. And from that time on, until the Federal Reserve System of 1916 or so, we had no national central bank, no central banking system. Another thing Jackson did was to defeat any attempts to pass appropriations for physical improvements, for improvements in transportation, for example, in the West and in the states. This was against his theory of what the federal government ought to do. He opposed the development of interior public works. And a third thing that Jackson opposed, which the Northerners wanted very much, was a higher tariff. By this time, the tariff argument began to be an important one because the North was becoming a commercial and industrial section and wanted tariffs to protect itself from competition from foreign goods. But the South, where you simply had essentially a one-crop economy, was essentially a colonial area dependent on importing goods from other places. And of course, it wanted the lowest possible prices for imported goods, whether they were to come from the North or from Europe. They wanted to set the North and Europe in competition with each other for providing lower prices for Southern consumers, and consequently, they opposed any kind of a tariff. And as long as the Democrats, Democratic Republicans shortened to Democrats, were in power, the tariff was kept extremely low. This becomes very important later on, remember. At the time, even before Jackson became president, sectional tension came to a head in 1820, as early as 1820. The reason for this is, remember we talked about how the states were even number of slave and free states? After the admission of Vermont in 1791 and Georgia and Tennessee in 1790, Tennessee and Kentucky by 1796, there were an equal number of slave and free states, 8. Ohio and Louisiana came in the first decade of the 19th century, and it was even at 9 and 9. Indiana and Mississippi came in as a pair by 1817, and it was 10 and 10. Then Alabama and Illinois came in as a pair in 1818 and 1819, and it was 11 and 11. But in 1820, Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state. Missouri was a peculiar case because not only was it west of the Mississippi River, it was also fairly far north. And at the same time Missouri was wanted to come in, Maine, the free state, wanted to come in as a free state from the north. A compromise was arranged by Henry Clay, the great compromiser, in which Missouri was admitted as a slave state, but a line was drawn at 36 degrees, 30 minutes longitude, which is the southern boundary of Missouri, and that line was drawn indefinitely to the west as far as the Pacific coast. And Clay's compromise provided that, except for Missouri itself, no slave states would be allowed north of that line in the new territories in the west. And that was part of the compromise. The other part was that Missouri would be admitted, and Maine would be admitted as a free state a couple of years later to keep the balance at 12 and 12. So in other words, this was the first sectional conflict. Thomas Jefferson was still alive at this point, called it the fire bell in the night. And it was solved by diplomacy, by political maneuvering by Clay, who was known, by the way, as the great compromiser. What made it possible to solve that? Well, essentially what made it possible was postponement. Because by drawing the Missouri Compromise line, Clay essentially said, we'll worry about the territory in the West later, We don't have to worry about it right now. Anything north of 3630 will designate as free territory. Anything south of it will designate as slave territory, and we'll postpone future consideration and bring in Maine right now. And so the problem was settled, and the two states came in, and people went back to thinking about other things. One of the other things that they started thinking about was New York City's enormous growth. Everybody else, all the other northern cities, immediately became very concerned because they saw what a terrific threat to their commerce and their prosperity New York was becoming. And so each of the major competitors of New York, the major cities in the East who are competitors of New York, devised their own ways of extending their influence back into the frontier, back into the new lands to the west. Boston had the misfortune of being the furthest from the new territories. New England just out to the east, a good deal more than you think. You think of New England as north. Actually, it's a good deal northeast of the rest of the country. So the distance from Boston to the west was considerable. And secondly, Boston had to cross a mountain range before it ever got to the Hudson River Valley, and that mountain range is very steep. And besides, once it got to the Hudson Valley, New York was in the way, so Boston was essentially shut out of the western commerce by New York City's Erie Canal and by the mountains. The Bostonians tried to dig a tunnel through those mountains, the Hoosac Tunnel. It took them about 30 years, and by the time it was finished, it was too late anyway. And Boston began to drop behind in the race for commerce from the west. And that is why, to this day, Boston is considered the home of old money, but has never been the great trading center that New York has been in the 19th century. Moving a little bit south, we find Philadelphia. Philadelphia also was concerned about New York's growth in the Erie Canal, pulling trade of the west into New York City. And in Philadelphia devised something called the Main Line of Pennsylvania Public Works. It was a canal system, basically, which was to extend from Philadelphia all the way west to Pittsburgh and beyond to the Ohio River. The catch was that the mountains are a good deal higher in Pennsylvania than they are in New York, where the Mohawk Valley is a natural path through the mountains, and the Erie Canal simply followed the Mohawk Valley. In Pennsylvania, you had to build canals that would go over mountains. And even in Pennsylvania, water will not run uphill. Pennsylvanians couldn't believe it. But even in Pennsylvania, they couldn't get their canal water to run uphill. So they had to devise something else to cover those sections of mountains. And what they devised was a series of inclined planes worked by stationary steam engines, 14 inclined planes that hauled canal boats out of the water and onto carts and up over the mountains by stationary steam engines and back down the other side and back into the water again. And this whole contraption was finished by about 1836, called the Pennsylvania Main Line of Public Works. And Charles Dickens wrote about it in American Notes. It was probably the most unusual transportation system ever devised. And, of course, it couldn't compete with the Erie Canal, and in 20 years was replaced by the railroads. Speaking of railroads, and this is a very important fact, steam power was put to work on the rivers as early as 1807. It was put to work in factories about the same time. And in 1825, in England, it was put to work hauling coal between Stockton and Darlington on the world's first common carrier railway. The people of Baltimore, Maryland, the fourth great East Coast port city, elected to not try what Philadelphia tried, to build canals. They already had a canal partway to the west, but they elected to try that newfangled device from England, the railway. And in 1829, the first American common carrier railway, the Baltimore and Ohio, designed to go from Baltimore to the Ohio River, was first opened between Baltimore and the suburb of Ellicott's Mills, about 14 miles away. That first open line was powered by a locomotive called the Tom Thumb, built by a New York man named Peter Cooper, which was so small it was called the Tom Thumb. And you remember the famous story about how the Tom Thumb raced the horse. The Tom Thumb was winning until it broke down, and the horse went on to win the race. That has to be the most Pyrrhic victory in all of history, because that's the only race the horse ever run against the steam engine. The steam engine immediately became the motive power superseding horses, sail cars, treadmills, and everything else they tried. And by 1832-33, the Baltimore and Ohio Railway, America's first common carrier, was committed to steam power. What did the steam engine do as applied to rails? Well, first it was conceived of as a way of covering land areas between rivers and between steamboats. For example, between the Ohio River and the Port of Baltimore. But it wasn't long until it became clear that the locomotive was a good deal faster than the canal boat. Rails didn't freeze up in winter as canals did, and it was very cheap to carry goods by rail, and a good deal faster. And consequently, railroads began to sprout. And as they grew, they developed in technology. They created another demand for steel and iron, even more so than before, not only for rails, but for the engines themselves and for the equipment. They created a great demand for iron, and they were able to haul large amounts of goods very fast uphill. That's extremely significant. By the 1850s, rail lines extended from the East Coast to Chicago and the Middle West, and were carrying huge quantities of goods from those producing states of Iowa and Wisconsin, Illinois, and Ohio, and Indiana and Michigan, directly to the East Coast, superseding the canals, which dropped out of the picture gradually after the railroads were built. What the railroads essentially did was to reverse the natural flow of commerce in the country. Instead of being north-south, as it had been when the flatboats and the keel boats and the steamboats ran down the rivers, the rails changed the natural direction of flow of commerce in the country to west to east instead of north to south. Even in the South, this was true. Charleston, South Carolina built the longest railway in America, the South Carolina Railway, as early as 1830-31, into the interior of Georgia. And so the seacoast cities built their rail lines into the country, extending their fingers, so to speak, into the countryside, and drawing goods from the natural north to south movement to east-west. And indeed, because the East Coast cities were closer ports to Europe, it was much faster and easier to ship goods to the East Coast for transshipment to Europe and vice versa than it was to ship them to New Orleans and then up the rivers. Much faster. So what was true of the natural flow of commerce in the country in 1815 was no longer true by 1850 or 52. With the victory in the War of 1812, you can call it a victory. It was actually a stalemate because neither side won anything significant or lost anything significant. But the main result of the War of 1812 was to confirm American independence. It essentially was the second war of revolution, and it ended the same way the first war did. And when it ended, the British evacuated their frontier posts, and essentially the cordon around the eastern colonies that had been first maintained by the French and then by the British and their Indian allies was broken through. So one of the main results of the War of 1812 in America was that release of energy that I was talking about in the case of Holland before and in the case of other countries. We saw it in this country in the first half of the 19th century. This tremendous energy of the growth, the rapid growth, the population growth, the industrial development, and it's also showed up in the arts. The first American real great artworks are done by Edgar Allan Poe, works of poetry and literature. And again, later, Longfellow, so many of the others, all came in the same period between the War of 1812 and the American Civil War. So the release of energy was enormous. At the same time, the United States began to expand rapidly. In addition to Louisiana, which was actually acquired in 1803, the huge Louisiana Territory, in 1819, Florida was acquired by treaty with Spain. The Spaniards were afraid they were going to lose it anyway, so they did what a baseball team does when they figure they're going to lose a free agent. They trade him before they can't get anything for him. Spain, by treaty, deeded Florida to the United States in 1819. Texas declared its independence from Mexico in 1835 and made it stick at the Battle of San Jacinto. And then 10 years later, in 1845, Texas applied for admission to the United States as a slave state and came in by joint resolution of Congress. Shortly after Texas was admitted to the United States, there was a border dispute between Texas and Mexico. And with the spirit of expansion in full cry, the United States attacked Mexico in the War of 1846, the Mexican War, and eventually captured Mexico City. And as a result of that war, acquired an enormous amount of territory, including what is now mostly California, Arizona, New Mexico, and the southwest part of the United States, acquired by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 as a result of the Mexican War. The Mexican cession was so enormous that it consisted of more than 500,000 acres, second only to Louisiana. Louisiana purchase of 800,000 acres as a territorial cession of the United States, before, of course, the purchase of Alaska, which came after the Civil War. So the United States was expanding rapidly in land area as well. The President of the United States, at the time much of this was going on, was one of the most underestimated and forgotten presidents in American history, James K. Polk. Polk had been Speaker of the House of Representatives, and nobody thought he was presidential material until in 1844, he was the first dark horse candidate. The Democrats couldn't agree on another candidate, and they chose Polk as their candidate. He came to office in 1844, served only one term. When he came to office, he said he had several goals, one of which was acquiring new territory, the Oregon border with Britain. I can't remember what some of the other ones, but he had 4 goals in all, and he achieved them all in his 4 years and retired. The only president in history you could say that about. Polk came to office at the time when Texas was admitted to the United States, just before Texas was admitted, and he was the president during the Mexican War. Polk also was the president at the time a treaty with Great Britain settled the Oregon boundary. That is to say, the boundary between what is now Canada, at that time in British North America, and the northwest part of the United States. The treaty just simply extended the existing boundary westward to the Pacific on the 49th parallel. American expansionists had wanted 54 degrees 40 minutes, which would have given the United States half of British Columbia, but that was an exaggerated claim, and the U.S. and Britain agreed on the 49th parallel, and the boundary with Canada was set in 1846, and from that day to this, there has never been a dispute over that boundary. There's never been a military action on that boundary. It's the longest undefended border between 2 great countries in the world, and it has been so ever since 1846. A real monument to diplomacy and to common sense and the ability of 2 peoples to get along with each other. In 1840, we saw another political development. The Whig Party had been formulated as an opposition to the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian Democrats. The Whigs were largely people of commercial importance, people of intellectual significance, kind of the upper crust, so to speak. And they had not found a way to elect a president. But in 1840, they found their way. And it's a remarkably instructive election because it tells us a lot about our elections today. The Whig candidate in 1840 was an apolitical man, a man who had no political principles whatsoever. Nobody knew anything about what he stood for politically. He was a general, William Henry Harrison, the victor of the Battle of Tippecanoe against the Indians. And he was an old man by this time. He was 69, I believe, or something like that. But William Henry Harrison was a created candidate. Because he had no political enemies, having been a general, he was a popular hero, and nobody knew what he was for or against, it was possible for the Whigs to create a candidate. And the candidate they created was the log cabin and hard cider candidate, the man of the people, William Henry Harrison, the popular general. Well, a lot of it was hogwash. William Henry Harrison came from one of the richest and most socially prominent families in the country. His grandfather had been a signer of the Declaration of Independence. His father had been governor of Virginia. His grandson was to be president of the United States. And the Harrison family is one of the oldest and richest in the country in Virginia. But don't let that stop you. The facts don't matter. Create your candidate. And so the Whigs hit on the popular formula of creating an image with a candidate who was a popular hero because of his military exploits and writing that into the White House. And indeed, we've seen that happen over and over again in American history. As recently as 1952, when the Republicans nominated Dwight Eisenhower, a popular general with no political stance whatsoever. Nobody knew whether he was a Democrat or Republican, in fact, at the time he was nominated. So the Whigs hit on the formula early. And they also hit on the idea of creating legends about their candidate, images, rather than issues. American elections are largely won on images rather than issues. And this is not only true today when we have the enormous image-making power of the media, the 10-second soundbite and all the rest. It was true in 1840. The techniques were different. You had brass bands and torchlight processions and pamphlets instead of TV spots, but the idea was the same, to create a winning image for your candidate and ride that to the White House. Unfortunately for William Henry Harrison, he had the shortest term of office of any president in American history. He was, as I said, 69 years old, and he insisted on giving his inaugural speech on March 4th, 1848, without a hat on. And it was a cold, raw day in Washington that day. And he got up there and talked for 3 hours without a hat on and caught pneumonia, and in 30 days he was dead. And he was succeeded as president by his vice president, John Tyler, who is truly one of the nothing presidents in American history. We had a string of ineffectual presidents, beginning with William Henry Harrison, who died, was succeeded by Tyler. Then James K. Polk, the one exception, 1844 to 48, the one very strong president in this whole period of 50 years or so. In 1848, he was followed by another Whig general, another man who followed the formula of coming to office with no political principles, not one way or the other, Zachary Taylor. But he died inconveniently a year or two into his administration and was succeeded by an absolute nonentity among presidents, Millard Fillmore. Today, even his name is a joke. In 1852, he was succeeded by Franklin Pierce, who was from New Hampshire, but was a northern man with essentially southern outlook. And essentially, that's what the formula was for the Democrats at that time. If the Whig formula was to nominate a general and nobody knew where he stood, and then make a popular hero out of him, the formula for the Democrats was to nominate a northern man who wouldn't interfere with the southern ideas or had a basically sympathetic outlook toward the South. So Franklin Pierce was elected in 1852. His college classmate was the great writer Nathaniel Hawthorne, and when Hawthorne heard that Pierce had been elected president, he said, "What? Frank Pierce is president of the United States? Good grief." Pierce had a very unfortunate experience. Shortly before he came to the White House, his son was killed in a railway accident, and his wife, in the 4 years that she was in the White House, never appeared in public. And Pierce was absolutely desolated and spent most of his 4 years in grief and really accomplished very little. He was succeeded in 1856 by James Buchanan, a Pennsylvania diplomat whose principal qualification for the presidency was that, again, nobody knew where he stood on the sectional issue because he'd been American minister to England and he'd been out of the country for several years. And also he was a northern man with essentially southern principles. But he was the last president elected by the Democratic Party, the old Democratic Party, before the Civil War. And we'll talk about why in a moment. After all, why do we have that string of ineffectual presidents? Well, the reason was that sectional tension was continuing to grow. The Mexican War hadn't made it better. In fact, it made it worse. Because in 1848, gold was discovered in California. And Polk announced it in his State of the Union address in 1849, and it set off the huge California gold rush, which was not only a national event, but actually a world event. People came from all over the world, from Europe, from Asia, to seek gold in California. It created a terrific rush to California, and immediately settlements. San Francisco grew up, and other areas, San Jose, Stockton, grew up in Northern California. Areas where there had been no people at all in 1840 became major communities by 1850, as people poured into San Francisco seeking gold. And immediately, California began to talk about statehood. This was a crisis, because after the admission of Wisconsin in 1848, there were exactly 15 free states and 15 slave states. But there was no more territory in which cotton would grow where slavery could be expended. And the Southerners knew it. Halfway across Texas, which came in as a slave state, the territory changes. You run into that Great Plains that we talked about, with the dry, arid plains where cotton won't grow. Further west from Arkansas was Oklahoma, hopeless, Indian territory, among other things. Further west from Missouri was Kansas, where there was only some slight chance that there might be cotton growing. Certainly north of that, the Missouri Compromise forbids settlement, and there was Great Plains territory anyway, cotton won't grow. And without the cotton culture, slavery was worthless. So there were no more areas left where the southern states could make more slave states. And when California applied for admission, it was obviously going to unbalance the Senate, and there would be more free states than slave states. And this is one of the things that the Southerners had been fearing ever since the beginning when they agreed to the Constitution in the first place. They had tried to arrange that they would always control the federal government so that slavery could never be abolished by the federal law. But they had already lost control of the House. They had effectively lost control of the presidency in the sense that they no longer controlled the vote in the House of Representatives. The presidential elections, by the virtue of national political parties, were no longer going to be thrown in the House of Representatives all the time. And now they were about to lose their deadlock in the Senate. This caused a terrific furor. As early as 1820, we mentioned the Missouri Compromise had been a sectional crisis. In 1830, 1831, South Carolina threatened to nullify federal laws, a so-called nullification crisis, which was put down by Andrew Jackson's nationalism. The man who was the leader of the South Carolina nullification movement was John C. Calhoun. And we have to talk about Calhoun and his northern opposite, Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, at this point. Because during this period of weak presidents, the Senate of the United States assumed the leadership role in the government. The Senate was where the major decisions were taken. And those three senators, Webster from Massachusetts, Calhoun from South Carolina, and our old pal Henry Clay, the great compromiser from Kentucky, were the three leading people in the Senate. Calhoun had originally been a nationalist, interestingly enough, back when the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans, controlled the government, and Southern interests were riding high. Long about the War of 1812, Webster, then a very young man, had actually been for states' rights because the federal government was dominated by the Southerners. States' rights is always the argument the outs take against the government in Washington, which they don't want to have dominate them. After the War of 1812 and the huge immigration into the North, the roles were reversed. The Southerners became the outs in Washington, who started yelling for states' rights, while the Northerners spoke for the national government because they were the ins in Washington. They were in power position. Calhoun's attempt at nullification failed when Jackson asserted himself and put it down, but Jackson was a strong nationalist. The presidents who followed him were not very strong at all. And in 1850, the idea of compromise looked impossible to attain. But Henry Clay, on his last legs, did arrange a compromise. California was permitted to come in as a free state, unbalancing the Senate. And in return, the South got something else, a stronger fugitive slave law. Slaves insisted on running away from slavery, and many of them ran north. And when they ran north, they were essentially free because the Northerners were not about to bring them back to slavery in the South as abolition became more and more popular in the North. So in order to give the Southerners something, the North agreed to a stronger, Northern Congressional delegation agreed to a strong fugitive slave law. This, again, caused huge outcry in the North. Many Northerners simply refused to obey it, with outright disobedience to the law. I mentioned that in 1852, Franklin Pierce, a Northern man with Southern principles, became president. Pierce's Secretary of War was Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, later to be president of the Confederacy. Davis was always a strong spokesman for Southern interests. And along about this time, after the Compromise of 1850 settled temporarily, once again, the sectional issue, but in an increasingly unstable way, the power of steam, which was driving the continent towards calamity, asserted itself again. By the 1850s, railroads had reached the Mississippi River. And now, with California in the Union, there was demand for a railroad to California. Now, at the time, nobody ever believed that any more than one railroad to California would ever be built. There would never be traffic for more than one. In fact, some people didn't think there'd ever be traffic for one. But it was obvious that a line was going to be built to California. The question was, where should it be built? Assuming that there was only going to be one line to California, wherever that line began would undoubtedly be the great terminus, the great city and the great section preferred to the other. Northerners wanted the line to start in Chicago, possibly in St. Louis. Southerners wanted it to start from Memphis or New Orleans, assuming that the trade of California would then be controlled by the South. One of the objections to the southern route was that the only practical route for a railway to California from New Orleans ran through a piece of territory still owned by Mexico, which had not been seceded in 1848. And so Jefferson Davis, who was working very hard to have a southern line built, sent James Gadsden of Alabama to Mexico with orders to purchase that missing piece of territory. And in 1853, Gadsden succeeded in purchasing what is now the southern part of Arizona, the Gadsden Purchase, south of the Gila River. And it was bought strictly to remove northern objections to a southern Pacific line. The North, Stephen Douglas, had an answer to that. Stephen Douglas was a Chicago politician who had a great deal of interest in land in Chicago and also in northern railroads. And Douglas was senator from the state of Illinois. In 1853, this Democrat, who was expected to be president someday, he had that kind of stature, although he was a very small man, he was known as the Little Giant, Douglas introduced into the Senate a piece of legislation he called the Kansas Nebraska Act. It would organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska separately. And Douglas's answer was to get that railroad built from Chicago west through Nebraska rather than through the south. In order to get Southern support for his line, he agreed to separate Kansas and Nebraska into two territories and organize them on what he called the basis of popular sovereignty. That is to say, the citizens of those areas would decide whether they wanted slavery or not. That Congress wouldn't forbid it or approve it, simply leave it up to the local vote. The trouble with this was that, in effect, it repealed the Missouri Compromise. Remember the Missouri Compromise line, that no slavery was to be permitted north of the southern border of Missouri? Well, Kansas lays north of the southern border of Missouri. So Douglas's idea of popular sovereignty repealed the Missouri Compromise prohibition of slavery north of 36 degrees 30 minutes. And what an outcry that caused in the North, where they were beginning to fear what they called the slave power. They saw it as grasping, aggressive, and seeking to assert itself at all times, sort of like the Red Menace of the middle 19th century. The slave power with capital letters, as Garrison used to print it in the Liberator. So the Kansas Nebraska Act caused a terrific uproar in the Congress, whether to pass it or not. Douglas and President Pierce twisted a lot of arms and succeeded in getting just enough Northern Democrats to vote for the bill, along with all the Southern Democrats, to get it passed in the Senate on a close vote. Some of the Northern Democrats refused to go along. They absolutely would not be part of it. The bill was passed, became law, and the results were a number of results. One of the results politically was that the Democratic Party began to split. The Whig Party split completely. All the Northern Whigs opposed the Kansas Nebraska Act, and all the Southern Whigs were in favor of it. In other words, the issue of sectionalism superseded the political strength of the party, the national unity of the party, and the Whig Party broke up completely. Enough Northern Democrats stayed with the administration to hold the party together and pass the bill at this point, but there was an enormous strain on it. Where did all those Whigs go, the Northern Whigs who left the Southern Whigs, and the Southern Whigs became Democrats? Well, the Northern Whigs joined with the Free Soilers, a small group who were encouraging abolition of any slavery in any of the territories, and they formed a new party, the Republican Party, which met for the first time in 1854 and nominated a candidate for president in 1856. His name was John C. Fremont. He was a very colorful character and a very crooked and strange one as well, flamboyant. But the important thing is that the Whig Party had split and a new sectional Northern Party, the Republican Party, was formed. There wasn't a Republican in the South. You couldn't find one. The Republican Party was strictly a Northern sectional party. In other words, the political unity of the country was beginning to fracture over the slavery issue, or the issue of what to do with slavery in the territories. The Republicans weren't strong enough to win an election in 1858, but they attracted a lot of support in the North, 1856 I should say, and in 1858, a former Free Soiler, a former Northern Whig named Abraham Lincoln, ran for Senate in Illinois against Douglas's Senate seat. They held a series of debates around the state of Illinois in 1858, called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. You've probably heard of them. And while Lincoln lost that election, he got so much notice, was so well noted for those debates against Douglas, he became a contender for the Republican presidential nomination. Another result of that Kansas-Nebraska Act was that, in addition to the political results, the economic results, in Kansas, slaveholders began to flood into the territory because there was going to be an election to see if the Kansas Territory would have slavery or not. Slaveholders from Missouri came pouring into Kansas, and then Free State men, led by Amos Lawrence of Massachusetts, created free colonies, anti-slavery colonies in Kansas, the most notable being Lawrence, Kansas. In 1856, a group of Southern slave sympathizers attacked Lawrence, sacked the town, burned it, and killed some people. In retaliation, a group of Northern anti-slavery fanatics, led by John Brown from New York State, a name you will undoubtedly recognize, attacked a community at Osawatomie, Kansas, and murdered several people in their beds. This fighting was called Bleeding Kansas, and it was really the prelude to the American Civil War. When the vote was held, Kansas vote, the so-called Lecompton Constitution providing for slavery in Kansas, was voted down. And the Southerners kept trying to pass it, and the people of Kansas kept voting it down. And eventually, after the war began, Kansas was admitted to the North as a free state. But Bleeding Kansas raised tensions enormously. There was actually fighting going on between pro-slave and anti-slave factions. Just to throw something else into the Salamagundi, 1852, a lady named Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was the daughter of a minister and the wife of a minister, was raised on Calvinist religion to her teeth, was living in Cincinnati with her husband, who was a professor at the Lane Theological Seminary there. And Cincinnati was in Ohio, a free state territory, but right across the river from Kentucky, which was slave state territory. And while she was living there, Harriet Beecher Stowe began to write a book about slavery. She called it Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it was the great publishing success of the 19th century. Hundreds of thousands of copies of it came out. Now, if you read Uncle Tom's Cabin today, it's a laugh. It's a joke. You can't possibly take it seriously. It's not even so much an anti-slavery book as it is a religious tract. And the characters are so stereotyped. You can't believe it. You laugh at this book. But it was considered an enormously important force in turning Northern opinion against slavery, with the depiction of the heroic Eva crossing the ice floe to freedom in the North, and the character's little Topsy who just growed, and poor old Uncle Tom, who died, the sainted old Uncle Tom. The characters are just incredible. But this book was an enormous influence in the North, so much so that later on, during the Civil War, when Lincoln was introduced to Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, so you're the little lady who brought on the big war. The South regarded this as enormously seditious propaganda and banned publication of the book, and became a huge cause célèbre. So the sections were growing further and further apart, emotionally as well as politically and economically. At the same time that the Whig Party was splitting and the pressure was building on the National Democratic Party, the churches were also splitting. This is the time at which you had the Northern Baptists splitting away from the Southern Baptists, again over the slavery issue. While ministers in the North were preaching that slavery was evil and wrong, ministers in the South were preaching that it was not only authorized by the Bible, but was the law of God. And the same church, with the same doctrines, would split into Northern and Southern factions. And this institutions, one after another, were splitting. The country was falling apart, driven again by the pressure of having to settle the arguments of slavery in the territories now. There was no way to put it off any longer. People were moving out there. People were living out there. What do you do with the slavery in the territories? Lincoln said in one of his famous speeches that a house divided against itself cannot stand. By that he meant that the United States cannot permanently exist half slave and half free. Either it would be all one thing or all the other, but it could not be an amalgam of both. And of course he was right about that. At this time, when Buchanan became president, tension was running high. The Supreme Court of the United States decided that in its great wisdom it was going to settle the slavery issue for once and for all. A test case was arranged involving a man named Sanford, a doctor, who had a slave called Dred Scott. Sanford took Dred Scott from Missouri, a slave state, across into Illinois, a free state, and then into a free territory, and had Dred Scott sue in the federal courts for his freedom on the grounds that, having been taken into a free state, he no longer was a slave. The case reached the Supreme Court in 1857. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was Roger Taney of Maryland, who was a slaveholder himself and a slave state advocate. And the court came down with a decision in 1857 that said that Dred Scott could not win his freedom in a federal court. But it not only did that, it not only disposed of the legal issue in the case, it went much further. It did something that courts are not supposed to do. It went beyond what it had to do to decide the decision and issued a pronouncement. It said that not only could Dred Scott not sue in a federal court, but that no black man could ever sue in a federal court, never had any standing to sue, no black person could ever be a citizen of the United States, and that slavery was not abrogated by taking a person to a free territory, and that this was the pronouncement, the issue is over, slavery is valid, and that's the end of it. Well, you can imagine how that went down in the anti-slavery North as well. Dred Scott, of course, was given his freedom by Sanford anyway, so it didn't affect him. The case personally didn't affect him. But the test case that brought to the Supreme Court caused such an outroar of indignation in the North that the Supreme Court went into eclipse for a good many years. Because if you think about it, the Supreme Court can issue decisions, but it has no power to enforce them. Andrew Jackson recognized that as long ago as the 1830s, when a case involving the Cherokee Indians came to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court held that the Cherokees were entitled to keep their land in Georgia and Tennessee, and Jackson said, now John Marshall's made his decision, let him try to enforce it. And he uprooted the Cherokees and sent them west so that the Americans could have the land. The Supreme Court has no power of enforcement of its own. It has to depend on the executive branch. And when a decision of the Supreme Court is so outrageous that the public will not accept it and the government will not enforce it, the court itself suffers a damaging loss of its prestige, which after all is the only thing it has to enforce its decisions. And so for many years after the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court of the United States was in disrepute, and its decisions were not taken very seriously. The Dred Scott case was one more load on the camel's back. But again, it wasn't the straw that broke the camel's back, not yet. In 1859, that same John Brown, who had murdered the anti-slavery settlers at Osawatomie, conceived a plan for raiding the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Now it's West Virginia. At that time it was Virginia. And arming the local slaves and starting a slave insurrection. Brown and some of his sons and several other men attacked the arsenal in 1859 at Harper's Ferry, succeeded in getting inside, but were trapped there by a band of federal Marines headed by a colonel named Robert E. Lee of Virginia, who captured Brown and some of his sons, those who weren't killed, and some of his men. Brown and several of his associates were hanged for treason, will you have it, against the state of Virginia. Not against the federal government. There's no, it's treason against the federal government is defined in the Constitution. But the state of Virginia charged them with treason against the state of Virginia and hanged them in 1859. John Brown's raid, again, caused a terrific reaction. This was an attack set to create the slave insurrection that the South so totally feared. In the North, Brown was regarded as a hero who was willing to give his life to destroy an evil institution. And now things are teetering on the very brink. The election of 1860 was going to be the deciding factor. The southern states, particularly South Carolina, announced that if their candidate, the southern candidate, was not elected in 1860, that they would not accept the results of the election and threatened to secede. The 1860 election was between those two candidates for the Illinois Senate race of 1858, Stephen Douglas, the National Democratic candidate, and Abraham Lincoln. But before the election even came about, the National Democratic Party convention couldn't agree on a platform and split. And a Southern convention met in Charleston and nominated John C. Breckinridge on a Southern ticket. And another candidate was nominated on a border state ticket, John Bell, the Constitutional Union Party, whose platform was to obey the Constitution. And he was attempting to be a moderate between the sections, which was by this time impossible. Lincoln, in a four-way race, won a majority of the electoral votes and the popular vote and was elected president. And the result was that South Carolina announced in December of 1860 that it would secede from the Union. And thus we come to the outbreak of the American Civil War.